My house disappeared. Not burned down, not demolished. Disappeared. One moment it was there, a vibrant masterpiece of coral pink and turquoise blue. The next moment, Karen stood on my lawn, mouth hanging open, staring at what looked like empty air. "What? Where?" she stammered. I smiled from my porch. "The only visible part of my property. You wanted it less bright, Karen. So I made it invisible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a color-obsessed HOA tyrant pushed an artist too far. My name is Emma Sullivan, and I'm 35 years old. I've been a graphic designer for 12 years, and color is literally my life. I see the world differently than most people I notice. The exact shade of sunset orange, the precise hue of morning sky blue, the subtle variations in green across a single leaf. When I finally saved enough money to buy my dream house in Meadowbrook Heights last March of 2024, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. The house itself was beautiful, a charming 2-story craftsman with a wraparound porch built in 1920. But the previous owners had painted it the most depressing shade of beige imaginable. Not warm beige, not elegant beige, just sad. Institutional beige that made the house look like it was apologizing for existing. I closed on the property on March 15th, 2024, and by March 16th, I had paint swatches covering every surface of my kitchen table. I spent 3 weeks choosing the perfect palette. Coral pink for the main body, not bubblegum. Not salmon, but a sophisticated coral that reminded me of Mediterranean sunsets. Turquoise blue for the trim, the exact shade of tropical water in Bora Bora. Creamy white for the porch railings. Soft lavender for the front door. It was bold, yes. Vibrant, absolutely. But it was also harmonious, carefully balanced. And most importantly, it made me smile every single time I looked at it. I hired a professional painting crew, and over 2 weeks in April of 2024, my house transformed from apologetic beige to confident coral. My neighbors stopped to watch the progress. Most of them loved it. "It's like a sunrise," said Margaret from across the street, who was 72 years old and had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 40 years. "Finally, something interesting to look at," laughed Tom and Jennifer Rodriguez, the young couple 2 houses down with 3 adorable kids under 10 years old. Even, quiet Mr. Peterson, the retired professor who lived next door and rarely spoke to anyone, gave me a thumbs up and said, "Reminds me of my grandmother's house in Key West." But there was one neighbor who did not love it. Karen Mitchell. Karen lived 4 houses down in a house so aggressively neutral it looked like someone had drained all the color out on purpose. Gray siding, gray shutters, gray door, gray everything. Her lawn was perfectly manicured, not a single blade of grass out of place. Her garden was organized by height and color in a way that somehow managed to be both impressive and soulless. Everything about Karen's house screamed control. I first met Karen on the day the painters finished. I was standing in my front yard, admiring the completed work, when I heard sharp footsteps on the sidewalk. I turned to see a woman marching toward me, with the posture of someone about to deliver bad news. "You must be the new owner," she said without introducing herself. She was around 50 years old, with severely styled brown hair and clothes that looked expensive but joyless, all blacks and grays and tans. "I'm Karen Mitchell, HOA compliance officer." I smiled and extended my hand. "Emma Sullivan, nice to meet you." "Isn't the house beautiful?" It's very bright," Karen interrupted, ignoring my hand. Her eyes scanned my house like she was documenting evidence. "Very, very bright." "Thank you," I said, choosing to take it as a compliment. "That wasn't a compliment," Karen said flatly. "Have you reviewed the HOA guidelines regarding exterior modifications?" "I have," I replied, keeping my smile in place. "The guidelines specify that exterior paint must be in good taste and harmony with the neighborhood aesthetic. I believe coral and turquoise are absolutely in good taste, and they harmonize beautifully with I'll be the judge of that." Karen cut me off. "I'll need to bring this before the Architectural Review Committee. We have standards in Meadowbrook Heights. We're not some bohemian artist colony." She made artist sound like an insult. I felt my smile tightened, but maintained my composure. I look forward to the committee's feedback. I'm confident they'll appreciate the thoughtful color selection and professional execution. Karen's expression suggested she had different expectations. She took 3 photos of my house with her phone, sniffed one said dismissive sound I would come to know very well, and walked away without another word. "Don't worry about her," said a friendly voice behind me. I turned to see an elegant Asian woman in her late 40s approaching from the sidewalk. She wore a sharp red blazer, despite the warm weather, red-framed glasses, and had blonde highlighted hair pulled back in a professional ponytail. She radiated competence and warmth simultaneously. "I'm Barbara Chun, HOA President. Welcome to Meadowbrook Heights." "Emma Sullivan," I said, shaking her hand with relief. "I take it Karen isn't president of my fan club." Barbara laughed. "Karen isn't president of anyone's fan club except her own. Don't let her intimidate you. Your house looks absolutely stunning. It reminds me of the painted ladies in San Francisco Victorian houses with bold, beautiful color schemes. Very tasteful, very professional." "Thank you so much," I said, feeling my anxiety ease. She mentioned an architectural review committee. "There will be a meeting next week," Barbara said, "but between you and me, your paint job is completely within guidelines. Bold doesn't mean inappropriate. I'm an architect myself, and I can tell you put real thought into these colors. They complement the craftsman's style beautifully." We talked for another 20 minutes. Barbara told me about the neighborhood, the monthly book club, the annual 4th of July barbecue, the community garden project. She mentioned that Karen had been compliance officer for 8 years and took her volunteer position very seriously. "Too seriously?" Barbara implied with a knowing look. "She means well," Barbara said diplomatically. "She just has very fixed ideas about how things should look. Her background is in law. She was a paralegal for 27 years. So she tends to interpret rules very literally and very strictly." "Does she do this to everyone?" "Primera asquith. Everyone who colors outside the lines, literally or figuratively," Barbara said with a wry smile. "Last year she tried to fine the Rodriguezes for having too many garden gnomes. 8 gnomes, to be exact. She claimed they were visual clutter. We overruled her. Obviously, the guidelines don't specify gnome limits." I laughed, but something in Barbara's tone suggested this wasn't just about paint colors or garden gnomes. This was about Karen's need to control the uncontrollable, to force everyone into her vision of suburban perfection. The Architectural Review Committee meeting was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. on Tuesday, May 7th, 2024. I arrived 15 minutes early with a portfolio. I'd prepared photos of historically painted craftsman homes, color theory documentation, and a letter from the painting company certifying their work met all professional standards. The meeting was held in Barbara's spacious living room. Besides Barbara and Karen, there were 3 other committee members. George Wu, a retired engineer in his 60s, Patricia Golston, a realtor in her 50s, and young Marcus Webb, a landscape designer who couldn't have been older than 20. Barbara called the meeting to order and asked me to present my case. I walked them through my portfolio, explaining how coral and turquoise were traditional Victorian-era colors, how the specific shades I'd chosen enhanced rather than clashed with the neighborhood's character, and how professional painters had ensured perfect execution. "Thank you, Emma," Barbara said when I finished. "Comments from the committee." "I think it's gorgeous," Marcus said immediately. "It's got character. Most houses on this street look like someone ran out of imagination at the paint store." Patricia nodded. "From a real estate perspective, distinctive properties often command premium prices. Buyers appreciate unique, well-maintained homes." George adjusted his glasses. "I see no code violations. The paint quality appears excellent, and the colors, while bold, are applied tastefully." Then Karen stood up. She'd been sitting silently, but her posture had been coiled tension the entire time. Now she placed a thick folder on Barbara's coffee table with a sound like a judge's gavel. "I have 17 photos of houses in this neighborhood," Karen said, opening the folder to reveal printed images. "Notice the color palette. Grays, tans, whites, muted blues, soft greens. These are appropriate colors. These are colors that respect the community aesthetic." She pulled out another sheet. I've also compiled a list of comparable neighborhoods with similar architectural styles. In every case, the dominant palette is neutral and understated. Emma's house, she said, my name like it hurt her mouth, is an aberration. It's jarring. It's inappropriate, and it sets a dangerous precedent. What precedent? Barbara asked calmly. That anyone can paint their house any garish color they want. Karen's voice rose. Today, it's coral and turquoise. Tomorrow, someone paints their house neon green, or hot pink, or rainbow stripes. Where does it end? The slippery slope argument, George said mildly. Classic logical fallacy. Karen's face flushed. This isn't a debate club. George, this is about maintaining property values and community standards. Emma's house looks like a beach resort dropped into our residential neighborhood. It's tacky. That's subjective. Patricia countered. I think it's charming. I think it's an eyesore. Karen shot back. And I'm formally requesting the committee order Emma to repaint her house in approved neutral colors within 90 days. Silence filled the room. I felt my stomach drop. 3 months of work, thousands of dollars. My dream home all threatened because Karen Mitchell thought coral was too colorful. Barbara looked at each committee member. Let's vote. All in favor of requiring Emma to repaint in neutral colors. Karen's hand shot up. She looked around expectantly. No one else moved. All opposed. Barbara, Marcus, Patricia, and George raised their hands. Motion denied, Barbara said firmly. Emma's paint job is approved. It meets all guidelines and is a beautiful addition to our neighborhood. Karen's face went from red to purple. This is ridiculous. You're letting personal taste override clear community standards. Actually, Barbara said, her voice still calm but with steel underneath, we're interpreting community standards fairly and reasonably. The guidelines don't specify a color palette. They specify good taste and harmony. Emma's house meets both criteria. This matter is closed. Karen gathered her folder with shaking hands. Fine. But this isn't over. There are other ways to enforce standards. She stormed out without another word, slamming Barbara's front door hard enough to rattle the windows. Well, Marcus said into the silence. That went well. Barbara turned to me. Emma, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Your house is beautiful, and you have nothing to worry about. But I was worried, because I'd seen something in Karen's eyes as she left something beyond anger or frustration. It was a look of cold calculation, of someone planning their next move, and I was absolutely right to be worried. 3 days later, on Friday, May 10th, I came home from work to find a formal letter in my mailbox. It was from Karen Mitchell, HOA compliance officer, informing me that I was in violation of community noise ordinances. According to her complaint, my wind chimes hanging from my front porch for exactly 2 weeks exceeded the acceptable decibel level and constituted a persistent disturbance to neighborhood tranquility. Wind chimes, the gentle, melodic wind chimes, I'd bought at a craft fair specifically because they had a soft, pleasant tone. I called Barbara immediately. She's retaliating, Barbara said, anger evident in her voice. The wind chimes are fine. Everyone has wind chimes. This is harassment. What can I do? I asked. Ignore it, Barbara said. Better yet, save it. Document everything. Karen's going to push this, and when she does, we'll need evidence of a pattern. Barbara was right. Over the next month, I received 6 more violation notices from Karen. May 17th, mailbox positioned 1.5 inches over the property line it was in TA had it surveyed. May 23rd, lawn height exceeding 3 inches. It was 2 3/4 inches, measured. May 30th, unauthorized decorative flagpole. It was a shepherd's hook for a bird feeder, which didn't require authorization. June 6th, improper trash bin placement. They were exactly where the trash company required them to be. June 13th, excessive outdoor lighting. I had 3 solar path lights. June 20th, Unauthorized vehicle parking my own car in my own driveway. Each notice threatened fines ranging from $50 to $200 if violations weren't corrected within 10 days. Each time, I documented everything with photos, measurements, and written responses. Each time, Barbara invalidated Karen's complaints. But the stress was exhausting. I found myself dreading coming home, wondering what new imaginary violation Karen would invent. I started second-guessing every decision about my property. Should I trim that bush? Would Karen call it overgrown? Should I water my lawn? Would Karen say I was wasting water? On June 25th, I was working in my home office when I heard shouting from outside. I looked out my window to see Karen standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, talking to a couple who'd stopped to admire my paint job. Completely against community standards, Karen was saying loudly. The HOA tried to shut it down, but certain board members have questionable judgment. Personally, I'd never buy a house in a neighborhood where people are allowed to paint their homes like circuses. I watched the couple exchange glances and walk away quickly. Karen noticed me in the window and smiled a cold, triumphant smile that made my blood run cold. She wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was actively sabotaging my reputation, trying to turn neighbors against me, poisoning the community well. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Karen's smile, her vindictiveness, her relentless campaign to make my life miserable, all because I painted my house colors that made me happy. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I was scrolling through design blogs when I came across an article about thermochromic paint that changes color or becomes transparent based on temperature. It was cutting-edge technology, used primarily for art installations and experimental architecture. The article showed a building that appeared to disappear when the temperature rose above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And suddenly, I had an idea. A brilliant, ridiculous, perfectly petty idea. If Karen wanted my house to be less bright, I would make it invisible. I started researching immediately, opening dozens of browser tabs about thermochromic pigments, architectural applications, and temperature-activated coatings. By dawn, I had a plan, foaming wild, expensive, and possibly impossible. But if I could pull it off, it would be the ultimate response to Karen's color tyranny. The question was, could I actually make a house disappear? And more importantly, how would I explain it when I did? Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who made your life miserable over something petty? What's the most creative revenge you've ever considered? Drop your stories in the comments. I need to know. I'm not the only one who's been driven to desperate measures by HOA tyranny. What I didn't know yet was that Karen had been documenting everything too, but her evidence wasn't about HOA violations. She'd been researching property law, looking for a way to force me out of Meadowbrook Heights permanently, and she was about to play her trump card. Emma Sullivan painted her craftsman house beautiful coral and turquoise colors, only to face relentless harassment from HOA compliance officer Karen Mitchell. After months of false violations and public humiliation, Emma discovered thermochromic paint and hatched a plan to make her house disappear. Meanwhile, Karen was plotting something far more sinister than HOA complaints. The morning after my thermochromic paint revelation, I woke up with the kind of manic energy that comes from either brilliant ideas or complete insanity, possibly both. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and started making calls. My first call was to Dr. Rebecca Jung, a materials science professor at State University who I'd found through my late-night research. Her lab specialized in smart materials and temperature-responsive coatings. I explained that I was a graphic designer interested in thermochromic applications for a residential project. Residential? Dr. Jung sounded intrigued. That's unusual. Most of our work is commercial or artistic installations. What exactly are you trying to achieve? I hesitated. How do you explain to a respected scientist that you want to make your house invisible to spite your neighbor? I'm exploring the idea of a temperature-responsive exterior coating that would create visual interest through environmental interaction. That sounded professional enough. Fascinating, Dr. Jung said. Can you come to the lab? I'd like to discuss this in person. How about Thursday at 2 p.m.? I agreed immediately. That gave me 5 days to refine my pitch and figure out if this crazy idea was even remotely feasible. My second call was to Webb, the young landscape designer from the HOA committee who'd voted in my favor. I'd gotten his number from Barbara, explaining I needed some gardening advice, which was true. I did need advice. Just not about gardening. Emma, Marcus answered on the second ring. What can I do for you? I need to talk to someone who won't think I'm insane, I said. Can we meet for coffee? 30 minutes later, we sat at Corner Brew Cafe, a cozy coffee shop 3 blocks from my house. I told Marcus everything current's escalating harassment, the thermochromic paint research, my meeting with Dr. Jung. To his credit, he didn't laugh or suggest I seek therapy. Instead, he grinned. That's the most brilliant, petty revenge I've ever heard. Please tell me you're actually going to do this. I don't know if I can, I admitted. It's probably too expensive, too complicated, and too insane. Or it's perfect, Marcus said. Look, Karen has been making people miserable in this neighborhood for years. She reported me once for having invasive plant species in a client's yard. They were decorative grasses from a nursery. She just didn't like how they looked. Someone needs to stand up to her. And this is standing up with style. His enthusiasm was contagious, but I still had practical concerns. Even if the technology works, even if I can afford it, won't this violate HOA rules? Making my house disappear seems like it might fall under exterior modifications. Marcus leaned back, thinking, here's the thing, your house won't actually disappear. It'll still be there, fully visible most of the time. The thermochromic effect would only activate at specific temperatures, right? So, technically, you're just repainting with a specialized coating. As long as the base color is approved, the fact that it has temperature-responsive properties is just a technical detail. I liked how he thought, you should have been a lawyer! God, no! Marcus laughed. I like helping things grow, not arguing about them. We talked for another hour, brainstorming ideas and potential obstacles. Marcus suggested I consult with Tom Rodriguez, the father of 3 who lived 2 houses down. Tom was a chemical engineer at a manufacturing plant and might have insights into large-scale coating applications. As we left the cafe, Marcus's expression turned serious. Emma, be careful. Karen's not. Jez and she's vindictive. If she finds out what you're planning, she'll try to stop you. Then we make sure she doesn't find out, I said. But keeping secrets in a neighborhood like Meadowbrook Heights was harder than I expected. That evening, I was watering my front garden when Karen drove past slowly, her head turning to stare at my house like she was memorizing every detail. She'd done this 3 times in the past week. Slow drives past my property, always staring, always with that calculating expression. Admiring the paint job, I called out cheerfully. Karen stopped her car. For a moment, I thought she might just drive away, but instead she put it in park and got out. She walked toward me with rigid posture, carrying a manila envelope. I'm not here to argue about paint, Karen said coldly. I'm here to inform you of a serious matter. I've been doing research into property records and municipal codes. My stomach tightened. And I've discovered that your property line is actually 3 feet further back than you think, which means your front porch, that garish coral and turquoise monstrosity, is partially built on HOA common land. She handed me the envelope. Inside were copies of old survey documents, plat maps, and highlighted sections of property law. I couldn't make sense of most of it, but the implication was clear. Karen was claiming my porch was illegal. This is ridiculous, I said, though my hands were shaking slightly. My porch has been here since 1928. It was here when I bought the house, and it was disclosed in all the property documents. Doesn't matter, Karen said with barely concealed satisfaction. If it's on common land, it's a violation. The HOA has the right to require its removal, or you could pay for an easement. Let's see. 3 feet by 14 feet of common land. That would be approximately $10,000. Plus surveying fees, plus legal fees. $10,000. She might as well have said $1 million. I'd already stretched my budget to buy the house and paint it. I didn't have $10,000 lying around for a bogus property line dispute. I'll have this reviewed by a surveyor, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You do that? Karen said. "In the meantime, I'm filing a formal complaint with the HOA board. If the survey confirms what I've found, you'll have 90 days to resolve the violation. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $100. $100 per day. For 90 days, that would be $9,000 in fines, on top of the $10,000 easement." Karen got back in her car and drove away, leaving me standing in my garden with shaking hands and a manila envelope full of accusations. I called Barbara immediately. She came over within 20 minutes, still in her red blazer from a work meeting. I handed her the envelope and watched as she studied the documents, her expression growing darker. "This is harassment," Barbara said finally, "and honestly, I'm not sure these surveys are even legitimate. These look like they've been pulled from archive records that predate modern GPS surveying. Property lines have been clarified and updated multiple times since these maps were created." But what if she's right? Primera, asketh. What if my porch really is uncommon land? Then we deal with it properly, Barbara said firmly. But Karen doesn't get to play property line investigator and make unilateral demands. The HOA board will review this. We'll hire an independent surveyor, and we'll handle it through proper channels, not through threats and intimidation. "She's trying to force me out," I said quietly. "She can't make me change my paint, so she's trying to bankrupt me with fake violations and property disputes." Barbara's jaw tightened. "She's done this before. 3 years ago, she went after an elderly couple who'd installed solar panels, claimed they violated the architectural guidelines, harassed them for months until they finally sold their house and moved. I wasn't president then, and the board let it happen. But I'm president now, and I won't let her drive you out." Barbara left me with reassurances and a promise to handle the HOA board meeting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was always going to be one step ahead, always finding new ways to make my life miserable. The next day, I met with Tom Rodriguez. He invited me into his home office, which was covered with children's artwork and family photos, a cheerful chaos that made me smile despite my stress. "Marcus told me you're planning something interesting," Tom said, closing the office door so we wouldn't be interrupted by his kids. "Thermochromic paint," I explained the concept. Tom listened carefully, occasionally nodding or asking technical questions. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "It's possible," he said finally. "Thermochromic pigments are well-established technology. The challenge is scaling it for exterior residential use. Most applications are small scaled rings, color-changing mugs, novelty items. Coating an entire house would require specialized formulation, weather resistance, UV stability, and consistent activation temperature." "So it's impossible?" I asked, deflating. "I didn't say impossible. I said challenging." Tom pulled up some information on his computer. "There are architectural firms experimenting with this technology. There's a building in Dubai that uses thermochromic glass that changes opacity based on temperature. A museum in Tokyo has panels that shift color with the seasons. If you can find the right manufacturer and the right formulation, you could potentially do this." "How much would it cost?" I asked, dreading the answer. Tom did some quick calculations. "For a house your size, custom thermochromic coating, professional application, weather-resistant formulation. Probably somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000. Maybe more if you need multiple rounds of testing." I felt my dream dissolving. Between Karen's property line threat and the cost of the thermochromic paint, I was looking at potentially $45,000. I didn't have that kind of money. Tom must have seen my expression. "But," he said carefully, "if this were positioned as a research project or an art installation, you might be able to offset costs. Universities sometimes fund experimental applications. Art grants exist for innovative projects. And if you document the process, you might even be able to sell the story to architectural or design publications. You think people would be interested in this?" I asked. "Are you kidding?" Tom laughed. "A woman makes her house invisible to spite her HOA neighbor. That's viral content. That's a feel-good story about standing up to petty tyranny. Document everything, their research, the application process, The final reveal. You could potentially crowdfund part of the cost if you frame it right. I left Tom's house with renewed hope and a growing plan. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about proving that creativity and determination could overcome bureaucratic bullying. This was about showing Karen and everyone else who'd ever been pushed around by small-minded authoritarians that you didn't have to accept their vision of how the world should look. My meeting with Dr. Jung on Thursday was even more encouraging. Her lab was a fascinating space filled with experimental materials, fabrics that changed texture with heat, ceramics that shifted color with pressure, polymers that became transparent at specific temperatures. "I love this idea," Dr. Jung said after I explained my project. "It's practical application of our research. It's visually striking. And honestly, it's a great story. My graduate students would learn so much from a real-world implementation at this scale." "So you think it's possible?" "Primera, asked. Not only possible, I think we can make it spectacular," Dr. Jung said. She showed me samples of thermochromic coatings her lab had developed. One patch of material was deep blue at room temperature, but became completely transparent when heated above 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Another shifted from forest green to pale yellow. A third went from solid black to nearly invisible. "The key is finding the right activation temperature," Dr. Jung explained. "Too low, and your house would be flickering in and out on mildly warm days. Too high, and the effect would rarely activate. For your climate, I'd recommend 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to be special when it happens, but common enough in summer to be impressive." 95 degrees, I repeated. "So, on really hot summer days, my house would just disappear. The coating would become transparent, revealing a reflective layer underneath that would blend with the environment." Dr. Jung, "It won't literally disappear, but it will create a striking optical effect that makes the house appear to fade into the background. With the right reflective it could look almost invisible from certain angles." We spent 2 hours discussing formulation, application methods, and testing protocols. Dr. Jung estimated she could develop a custom coating within 6 weeks. The cost would be approximately $18,000, which included materials, lab time, and application assistance from her graduate students. It was more than I had. But Tom's suggestion about positioning this as a research project gave me an idea. What if we documented this as a case study? Primera, asked. Your lab gets research data on large-scale residential application. I get my house painted, and we both get publicity for pushing boundaries in architectural materials. Dr. Jung's eyes lit up. "I could potentially get university funding for that. Let me talk to my department chair. If we can frame this as experimental architecture research, we might be able to cover most of the material's cost. You'd still need to pay for labor and the base coat preparation, but that would cut your expenses significantly." We shook hands, and I left the lab feeling like this impossible dream might actually happen. But the universe wasn't done testing me yet. 2 days later, on Saturday morning, I woke up to find my front garden destroyed. Someone had driven through my flower beds, crushing the lavender and daisies I'd spent weeks planting. Muddy tire tracks led from the street, across my lawn, through my garden, and back to the street. I stood in my ruined garden, staring at the destruction, feeling tears of frustration building. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Margaret from across the street came hurrying over, still in her bathrobe. "Emma, dear, I saw... What happened?" "I called the police." "Are you all right? Who did this?" I asked. "I don't know," Margaret said. "It happened around 3 o'clock in the morning. I heard a loud engine, looked out my window, and saw a dark pickup truck speeding away. I couldn't see the license plate or the driver. The police came and took a report, but without witnesses who could identify the vehicle or driver, there wasn't much they could do. Officer Ramirez suggested I install security cameras, which I absolutely couldn't afford after budgeting for the thermochromic paint project. I was cleaning up the garden debris when Barbara arrived, her face tight with anger. "I heard what happened," she said. "Emma, I want you to know this is going too far. This is beyond HOA disputes. This is vandalism and possibly harassment. We need to escalate this. You think Karen did this? Primera. Ask it. I can't prove it, Barbara said carefully, but I know she drives a dark pickup truck. And I know she was furious after the board meeting on Friday night when we rejected her property line claim against you. The board rejected it? I felt a rush of relief. Unanimously, Barbara said. We hired an independent surveyor. Your property lines are exactly where they should be. Karen's evidence was based on misinterpreted historical documents and selective reading of outdated surveys. Her complaint was completely baseless. We told her if she filed any more frivolous claims against you, she'd be removed from her compliance officer position. So Karen had lost, and hours later, my garden was destroyed. I can't prove she did this, I said, but I can make absolutely sure she regrets pushing me this far. Barbara studied my face. You're really going to do the thermochromic paint, aren't you? I'm not just going to do it, I said. I'm going to make it the most spectacular thing this neighborhood has ever seen. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing everything for the thermochromic installation. Dr. Jung secured partial university funding. Tom helped me develop an application plan. Marcus coordinated with local media interested in covering an experimental art house. Everything was coming together perfectly. And then, exactly 1 week before the scheduled paint application, I received a certified letter. Karen wasn't done fighting. She'd filed a lawsuit claiming my house was a public nuisance and demanding I be forced to sell the property. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was war. Have you ever had a conflict escalate way beyond what seemed reasonable? Have you ever wondered how far someone would go just to be right? Let me know in the comments, because this story is about to get even crazier. What I didn't realize was that while I was planning my disappearing house, someone was recording everything. Karen had installed cameras pointed at my property, documenting every visitor, every conversation, every preparation. She was building a cast knot, just for nuisance complaints, but for something far worse, and her evidence was about to blindside me completely. Emma's quest to create a disappearing house was gaining momentum with help from Dr. J. University lab and supportive neighbors, but Karen escalated from HOA complaints to property destruction and finally to a lawsuit, claiming Emma's house was a public nuisance. With cameras trained on Emma's property and legal threats mounting, the battle was about to reach its climax. The certified letter from Karen's attorney arrived on a Tuesday morning in early July of 2024. I sat at my kitchen table, reading the legal complaint with growing disbelief. Karen wasn't just claiming my house was a nuisance. She was arguing that my garish and offensive color choices had decreased her property value by an estimated $30,000 and caused her ongoing emotional distress and mental anguish. Emotional distress. From pink colors, the lawsuit demanded I either repaint my house in neighborhood-appropriate neutral tones within 30 days or pay Karen $30,000 in damages. If I refused both options, she was seeking a court order to force the sale of my property. I called Barbara immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. She can't do this, I said when Barbara answered. Can she actually do this? Let me see the complaint, Barbara said. I'm coming over right now. Barbara arrived 20 minutes later with someone. I didn't recognize a tall black woman in her early 40s with an air of quiet calm. She wore a navy blue pantsuit and carried a leather briefcase. Emma, this is Diane Foster, Barbara said. She's an attorney who specializes in property law and HOA disputes. I called her as soon as you told me about the lawsuit. Diane shook my hand firmly. Nice to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. May I see the complaint? I handed her the letter. She read it carefully, her expression neutral except for an occasional raised eyebrow. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me directly. This is a nuisance lawsuit, Diane said, and I mean that in both the legal sense and the colloquial sense. Karen's attorney is either incompetent or knows this is baseless and took the case for the fees. The complaint has virtually no legal merit. So I don't have to worry, I asked hopefully. I didn't say that. Diane, even a baseless lawsuit requires a response, costs money to defend, and creates stress. That's the point. Karen's trying to exhaust you financially and emotionally, until you give up and leave. It's a form of legal harassment, called a slap-suit strategic lawsuit, against public participation. What do I do? Primera, ask it. You fight back, Diane said simply. You file a response. You gather evidence that your property hasn't decreased anyone's values in fact. I bet your vibrant house has increased interest in the neighborhood. You counterclaim for harassment and malicious prosecution. You make it expensive and uncomfortable for Karen to continue this vendetta. I don't have money for a long legal battle. Primera, admite. I've already invested everything I have in the Thermochromic paint project. Diane smiled. About that, Barbara told me what you're planning. That's actually brilliant. And it might be the key to defeating this lawsuit. If we can show that your house is part of a legitimate art and research project, it becomes much harder for Karen to claim it's a nuisance. Academic research and artistic expression have strong legal protections. Barbara nodded. I've been thinking about this, too. Emma, what if we position your house as a community art installation? The HOA could officially endorse it as an innovative neighborhood beautification project. That would make Karen's lawsuit not just against you, but against an HOA-approved initiative. Would the HOA board approve that? I asked. 4 out of 5 board members already support you, Barbara said. Karen's the only dissenting vote, and she's not even on the board, she's just compliance officer. We can call an emergency meeting and vote on this tomorrow night. Over the next 24 hours, things moved quickly. Diane filed a preliminary response to Karen's lawsuit, citing lack of merit and announcing our intention to counterclaim. Barbara scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting for Wednesday at 7:00 p.m. Dr. Jung prepared a formal research proposal documenting the Thermochromic house as an experimental architecture project. The emergency meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. By 6:45 p.m., the room was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood about Karen's lawsuit, and apparently everyone had opinions. I arrived with Barbara, Diane, Dr. Jung, Marcus, Tom, and Jennifer Rodriguez. Margaret from across the street was there with at least a dozen other neighbors. Even quiet Mr. Peterson showed up, sitting in the back row with his arms crossed. Karen arrived exactly at 7:00 p.m., alone, carrying an oversized folder. She looked around the crowded room with barely concealed contempt. Barbara called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming. Tonight, we're voting on a proposal to designate Emma Sullivan's residence as an official neighborhood art and research installation in partnership with State University's Materials Science Department. Before we bought, Emma would like to present her project. I stood up, my prepared notes trembling slightly in my hands. I explained the thermochromic paint technology, Dr. Jung's research, the university partnership, and the potential for Meadowbrook Heights to become known for innovative architectural art. This isn't just about my house, I said. It's about showing that our neighborhood values creativity, education, and pushing boundaries. It's about proving that beauty can take many forms, and that we're not afraid to be interesting. Dr. Jung spoke next, explaining the scientific value of the project and the publicity benefits for the neighborhood. This has the potential to be featured in architectural journals, design magazines, and educational programs. Meadowbrook Heights would be associated with innovation and forward-thinking community values. Then Karen stood up. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice tight with anger. You're all being manipulated by someone who can't follow simple rules. Emma painted her house in offensive colors, and now she's trying to justify it by calling it art. Well, I can throw paint at a wall and call it art, too, but that doesn't mean it belongs in a residential neighborhood. Your objection is noted, Barbara said calmly. Does anyone else wish to speak? Margaret raised her hand. I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never seen someone work so hard to make their neighbors miserable as Karen has. Emma's house is beautiful. It makes me smile every day. And frankly, I'm tired of watching Karen bully anyone who doesn't conform to her bland, joyless vision of what a neighborhood should be. Scattered applause erupted. Karen's face flushed red. Tom Rodriguez stood up next. As a chemical engineer and a father, I think this project is fantastic. My kids are fascinated by the idea of a color-changing house. They've been learning about thermodynamics and materials science because of Emma's project. That's educational value right there, more a plus. Karen sat down heavily. Her jaw clenched. Mr. Peterson surprised everyone by standing up. I'm a retired art history professor, he said in his quiet voice. I've spent my career studying how communities respond to innovative art. And I can tell you that the neighborhoods that thrive are the ones that embrace creativity, not the ones that crush it. Emma's house reminds me why I love this neighborhood. Karen's lawsuit reminds me why I sometimes don't. The room erupted in applause. Barbara smiled and raised her hand for quiet. Thank you all for your input. Now we'll vote. All in favor of designating Emma Sullivan's residence as an official neighborhood art and research installation. 4 hands went up. Barbara, Marcus, Patricia, and George. Karen's hand stayed firmly down. Motion passes 4-1, Barbara announced. Emma, your house is now officially a Meadowbrook Heights art installation. Congratulations. The room applauded. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back. Karen gathered her folder and walked out without another word, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence her departure created. Well, Marcus said into the quiet, that was dramatic. The laughter that followed released all the tension in the room. Neighbors came up to congratulate me, share their own Karen stories, and ask questions about the thermochromic paint. It felt like the whole community was rallying around not just my house, but the principle of standing up to bullying. But I knew Karen wasn't done. The following week was consumed with preparation for the paint application. Dr. Jung's lab had finalized the thermochromic coating, formulation Specialise, polymer that would activate at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, causing the pigment layer to become transparent and reveal a highly reflective metallic underlayer that would blend with the sky and surrounding environment. The application process would take 5 days. First, the house needed to be primed with the reflective base coat, a specialized silver-white coating that would provide the invisible effect when the thermochromic layer became transparent. Then the thermochromic layer would be applied in multiple thin coats to ensure even activation. Finally, a UV protective clear coat would seal everything. Dr. Jung brought 3 graduate students, Maya, James, and Robert, who would be documenting the entire process for their research. Marcus arranged for a photographer from Design Today magazine to cover the installation. Tom helped me calculate optimal application times based on weather forecasts. The work began on Monday, July 15. The painting crew arrived at 7:00 a.m. with specialized equipment and enough coating to cover my entire house, approximately 2,000 square feet of exterior surface. Karen's response was immediate. By 8:00 a.m., she was parked across the street in her pickup truck, watching. She stayed there for 4 hours, leaving only when it started to rain lightly around noon. She's documenting everything, Barbara said when she stopped by during her lunch break, building her case that this is somehow a nuisance or violation. Let her watch, I said. There's nothing illegal or improper about what we're doing. The HOA approved it, the city issued the permit, and we're following all codes. But Karen's surveillance was unnerving. Every day that week, she appeared sometimes in her truck, sometimes walking slowly past my house, always with her phone out, recording or photographing everything. On Wednesday, she escalated. A building inspector showed up at 10:00 a.m., clipboard in hand, saying he'd received a complaint about unpermitted construction. We have all our permits, I told him, showing him the paperwork Dr. Jung had helped me file. The inspector reviewed everything, checked the work, and nodded. Everything looks in order. Professional job. Who filed the complaint? Take a wild guess, I said, gesturing toward Karen's truck parked across the street. The inspector sighed. Look, I don't know what's going on here, but you're doing everything right. My advice: document everything. If she keeps filing false complaints, that's harassment, and you can pursue legal action. That evening, Diane Fosted called with news about Karen's lawsuit. Her attorney withdrew from the case, Diane said. Officially, they cited irreconcilable differences with the client, But reading between the lines, I think the attorney realized the case was garbage and didn't want to risk sanctions for filing frivolous claims. "So the lawsuit is over?" I asked, hopefully. "Not quite," Diane cautioned. "Karen can still represent herself, or find another attorney willing to take the case. But this is a very good sign. It means even her own lawyer thought she was wrong." By Friday afternoon, July 19th, the thermochromic application was complete. My house looked stunning. The coral pink and turquoise colors were even more vibrant than before, with a subtle metallic sheen from the underlying reflective layer. Dr. Jung explained that the thermochromic coating was currently in its opaque state because the temperature was only 87 degrees Fahrenheit. "We need 95 degrees for full activation," she explained. "Based on the weather forecast, we should get there tomorrow afternoon. That's when we'll see the full effect." That night, I could barely sleep. Tomorrow would prove whether months of work, thousands of dollars, and countless hours of research would result in something spectacular or something silly. What if the effect wasn't impressive? What if it looked strange instead of striking? What if Karen had been right all along, and I was just being stubborn and ridiculous? But the next morning, Saturday, July 20th, dawned bright and hot. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 92 degrees Fahrenheit. By 1 p.m., it hit 95 degrees, and my house started to disappear. It happened gradually, like watching a photograph fade. The vibrant coral and turquoise began to pale, becoming translucent. The reflective underlayer became visible, catching the blue of the sky, the green of surrounding trees, the white of passing clouds. Within 15 minutes, my house had transformed from a bold statement of color to a shimmering, almost ethereal structure that seemed to blend into the air itself. I stood in my front yard, staring in amazement. Dr. Jung and her students were taking measurements and photographs. Marcus was recording video on his phone. Tom and Jennifer Rodriguez had brought their kids to watch, and all three children were pointing and shouting with excitement. "It actually worked," I whispered. "It's incredible," Dr. Jung said, her voice filled with professional satisfaction and personal delight. "The activation is even more dramatic than I predicted. The reflective layer is catching light from every angle. It's like the house is there, but not there." A crowd had gathered, neighbors from all over Meadowbrook Heights, drawn by word of mouth and social media posts. Margaret was crying happy tears. Mr. Peterson was taking photos with an expensive camera. Even Patricia Goldstein was there, already on her phone with someone from a real estate magazine. And then I saw Karen. She stood at the edge of my property, staring at my house, or rather, at the space where my house appeared to be dissolving into air. Her expression was impossible to read. Shock, anger, disbelief, all of the above. I walked over to her, my heart pounding. For a moment, we just stood there, looking at each other. "You wanted it less bright," I said quietly, "so I made it invisible." Karen's expression shifted from shock to something harder, a cold, calculated look that made my stomach drop. Without a word, she pulled out her phone and made a call, speaking in low, urgent tones I couldn't hear. When she hung up, she smiled at me, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Enjoy this while it lasts," she said, "because I just called the city planning department and the fire marshal. If you think the HOA was your biggest problem, you're about to learn what real problems look like." She walked away, leaving me standing in front of my disappearing house, wondering what she'd set in motion. The temperature was still 95 degrees. My house was still invisible, and I had no idea what was coming next. Have you ever had a victory that felt too good to be true? Have you ever celebrated too early, only to have the rug pulled out from under you? Share your experiences in the comments, because this story isn't over yet. What Karen didn't tell me was that she'd been in contact with a city councilman for weeks, someone who owed her favors from her paralegal days. She'd been preparing a case that my house violated city ordinances about reflective surfaces causing traffic hazards. And the councilman had already scheduled an emergency city council hearing for Monday morning. I had less than 48 hours before my dream house could be declared illegal by the city itself. Emma's thermochromic house successfully disappeared when temperatures hit 95 degrees, stunning the neighborhood and vindicating months of work. But Karen immediately retaliated by calling city officials. And Emma discovered she had less than 48 hours before an emergency city council hearing that could declare her dream house illegal. The final battle was about to begin. I spent Saturday night in a state of controlled panic. Karen's threat about the city planning department and fire marshal kept replaying in my head. What ordinances could my house possibly violate? The thermochromic coating was just specialized paint, but still just paint. It wasn't structural. It wasn't dangerous. It was just unusual. Barbara came over Sunday morning with coffee and strategy. She'd already made calls to her contacts in city government, trying to understand what Karen had set in motion. The hearing is scheduled for Monday at 9:00 a.m., Barbara confirmed, sitting on my porch in our signature red blazer despite the summer heat. Karen filed a complaint claiming your house creates a traffic hazard because the reflective coating could distract drivers or cause accidents. She's also claiming it violates city codes about exterior modifications to historic properties. Historic properties? I said. My house was built in 19... It's old, but it's not on any historic register. Doesn't matter, Barbara said grimly. Karen found an obscure city ordinance about properties built before 1950 in designated residential zones. The ordinance requires city approval for any exterior modifications that substantially alter the visual character of such properties. She's arguing your thermochromic paint qualifies. But we have HOA approval, university partnership, all the permits for the paint application. Yes, Barbara interrupted, but apparently no one thought to check this particular city ordinance because it's almost never enforced. It's one of those old laws that stays on the books but rarely gets applied. Karen dug it up specifically to use against you. I felt my carefully constructed victory crumbling. Karen's pattern of harassment is well documented. We have evidence of false HOA violations, the dismissed lawsuit, the property destruction, and now this sudden concern about city ordinances she never cared about before. This is textbook targeted harassment. We spent the rest of Sunday preparing. Dr. Jung, COMPILED. Research data showing the safety of thermochromic coatings. Tom Rodriguez prepared a traffic analysis showing no increase in accidents or near misses on our street since the house was painted. Marcus gathered testimonials from neighbors supporting the project. Margaret organized a petition that gathered 137 signatures from Meadowbrook Heights residents in just 6 hours. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still vulnerable. Karen had political connections I didn't have. She'd been working in the local legal system for 27 years. She knew how to manipulate bureaucracy in ways I'd never imagined. Monday morning arrived hot and bright. The temperature was already 89 degrees at 8:00 a.m., climbing toward another 95-degree day. My house was still fully visible in its coral and turquoise glory, but by afternoon it would disappear again, which suddenly felt less like a triumph and more like evidence for Karen's case. The city council chambers were packed. I arrived with Barbara, Diane, Dr. Jung, and what felt like half of Meadowbrook Heights. Margaret was there with at least 20 neighbors. Tom and Jennifer Rodriguez brought their kids, turning this into an impromptu civics lesson. Mr. Peterson sat in the front row with his camera, documenting everything. Karen sat on the opposite side of the room with 2 men. I didn't recognize one wearing an expensive suit, the other in a city inspector's uniform. She looked confident, almost smug. When she saw me, she smiled that cold smile I'd come to hate. The city council consisted of 7 members, led by Chairman Douglas Webb, a stern-looking man in his 60s. He called the hearing to order at exactly 9:00 a.m. We're here to address a complaint filed by Ms. Karen Mitchell regarding property at 173 Maple Street, owned by Ms. Emma Sullivan, Chairman Webb said. Ms. Mitchell, please present your case. Karen stood up, composed and professional. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here today because I'm concerned about public safety and the integrity of our city's historic neighborhoods. Ms. Sullivan has applied an experimental coating to her house that creates a reflective, disorienting effect that poses a traffic hazard. Additionally, Her modifications violate City Ordinance 7-3-20-1 regarding exterior changes to pre zones. She presented her evidence photos of my house in its invisible state, the text of the obscure ordinance, and a statement from one of the men she'd brought, who identified himself as Russell Hammond, a traffic safety consultant. "I've reviewed photos of the property," Hammond said in a bored monotone that suggested he was being paid to say this. "The reflective coating could potentially cause momentary distraction to drivers, particularly during high-temperature periods when the effect is most pronounced." "Could potentially," Diane Foster whispered to me. "Not has caused or will cause, just theoretical possibility." The council members asked Karen a few questions, mostly about whether there had been any actual traffic incidents. Karen admitted there had been none, but insisted that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Then it was our turn. Diane stood up. "Every inch," the professional attorney, Chairman Webb, council members, "we're here today because Ms. Mitchell has engaged in a systematic campaign of harassment against Ms. Sullivan. This complaint is the latest in a series of increasingly desperate attempts to force Ms. Sullivan from her home simply because Ms. Mitchell disapproves of her paint choices." Diane walked the council through the timeline, the false HOA violations, the dismissed lawsuit, the documented pattern of retaliation. She presented evidence that Karen had never filed complaints about any other properties in the neighborhood, despite numerous homes with reflective windows, metal roofs, and other features that could theoretically cause driver distraction. "This isn't about public safety," Diane said. "This is about one person's inability to accept that she doesn't control her neighbor's choices." Then Dr. Jung presented the scientific case. She explained thermochromic technology, showed safety data from similar installations worldwide, and documented that the coating met all federal safety standards for exterior building materials. There is no credible evidence that this installation poses any traffic hazard. Dr. Jung concluded, "The reflective effect is subtle, occurs only during specific temperature conditions, and is no more distracting than numerous other common architectural features like glass windows or metal railings." Tom Rodriguez presented his traffic analysis, showing that in the 4 weeks since the thermochromic coating was applied, there had been 0 accidents, 0 traffic citations, and 0 complaints from any drivers except for Karen. Barbara spoke next, representing the issue. The Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association voted 4-1 to approve this project as a community art installation. It has brought positive attention to our neighborhood, educated residents about innovative architecture, and demonstrated that we value creativity and progress. The only person who objects is Ms. Mitchell, who has a documented history of using her volunteer position to harass residents who don't conform to her personal aesthetic preferences. Then Margaret stood up, her 72-year-old voice surprisingly strong. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years. I've seen neighbors come and go, watched children grow up, celebrated weddings and mourned funerals, and in all that time, I've never seen anyone work so hard to make others miserable as Karen Mitchell. Emma's house is beautiful. It makes people smile. It makes children curious about science. It makes our neighborhood interesting. Karen's complaints make our neighborhood exhausting." The room erupted in applause. Chairman Webb banged his gavel for order, but I saw a slight smile tug at his lips. "Does anyone else wish to speak?" he asked. To my surprise, Mr. Peterson stood up. "I'm Harold Peterson, retired art history professor. I'd like to offer some historical context. Throughout history, innovative architecture has always faced resistance from those who fear change. The Eiffel Tower was called an eyesore. The Sydney Opera House was considered ridiculous. Frank Lloyd Wright's designs were labeled dangerous and impractical. Yet all of these became celebrated landmarks precisely because they dared to be different. Miss Sullivan's house is part of that tradition, art that challenges, inspires, and ultimately enriches the community around it. More applause. Karen's face was tight with anger. Chairman Webb conferred quietly with the other council members for several minutes. This council takes public safety seriously, but we also recognize vexatious complaints designed to harass law-abiding citizens. Having reviewed all evidence presented today, we find no credible basis for Ms. Mitchell's traffic hazard claim. Miss Sullivan's house has been properly permitted, meets all applicable safety standards, and has generated 0 legitimate complaints from anyone except the complainant herself. Karen half stood from her seat, her face flushing. But the ordinance, regarding Ordinance 7-3-21, Chairman Webb continued. Ignoring the interruption, we find that while Miss Sullivan's property was built in 1920, the ordinance in question was intended to preserve historic character in designated historic districts. Miss Sullivan's neighborhood is not such a district. Therefore, the ordinance does not apply. Furthermore, even if it did apply, we would exercise our discretion to grant a variance given the project's artistic merit and community support. He banged his gavel. Complaint dismissed. This hearing is adjourned. The room erupted in cheers. Tom's kids were jumping up and down. Margaret was hugging everyone within reach. Barbara grabbed my hand and squeezed it. Diane was smiling broadly. I looked across the room at Karen. She sat frozen, her expression a mixture of shock and fury, and something else, maybe, or the realization that she'd finally pushed too far. As people filed out of the council chambers, Karen gathered her papers and walked toward the exit. On impulse, I followed her outside into the bright morning sunshine. "Karen!" I called out. She turned, her expression wary. "It's over," I said. "You lost. Not just today, Sullivan. The HOA complaints. The lawsuit. This hearing. You've lost every single battle you've picked with me. Don't you think it's time to just let it go?" For a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes, maybe exhaustion, maybe recognition that she'd wasted months of her life on a pointless vendetta. But then her expression hardened again. "You think you've won?" she said coldly. "You think having a gimmick house makes you special? You're still just a Ms. Mitchell." We both turned. Chairman Webb stood in the doorway, his expression stern. "I'd be very careful about what you say next. This council takes harassment seriously. If we receive any further complaints about Miss Sullivan that prove to be baseless, we'll consider sanctions against the complainant. Do you understand?" Karen's mouth opened and closed. Finally, she turned and walked to her truck without another word. Chairman Webb nodded at me. "Miss Sullivan, your house is remarkable. My daughter's an architecture student at State, and she's been following Dr. Jung's research. She's already asked if she can write her thesis on thermochromic residential applications. You might have started something bigger than you realized." The temperature hit 95 degrees that afternoon. Right during the neighborhood block party, Barbara organized to celebrate our victory. My house began its transformation as we stood in my front yard, friends, supporters, and curious onlookers, all watching as the coral and turquoise slowly faded into translucent shimmer and then into near. Children ran around the invisible house, giggling and trying to take selfies with the disappearing walls. Adults marveled at the effect, taking photos and videos. Dr. Jung and her students conducted interviews for their research. A reporter from Design Today captured everything for an article that would later be picked up by national publications. And I stood in the middle of it all, watching my dream house flicker between visible and invisible as clouds passed overhead, thinking about how a simple desire to live in beautiful colors had turned into a battle for creative freedom, community support, and the right to be different in a world that often demanded conformity. Barbara came up beside me, raising a glass of lemonade and toast. "You did it. You actually did it." "We did it," I corrected. "I couldn't have fought Karen without you, without without all of this." I gestured at the crowd of celebrating neighbors. "True," Barbara said, "but you gave us something to fight for. You showed us that sometimes the right response to small-minded tyranny is spectacular. Creative defiance." 3 months later, my house was featured in Architecture Digest with a 12-page spread titled "The Invisible House: When Art Meets Activism." Dr. Jung's research paper was published in the Journal of Smart Materials. Marcus used the publicity to launch his own innovative landscaping business. Tom's kids won a science fair with a project on thermochromic materials. And Karen? She resigned as HOA compliance officer 2 weeks after the city council hearing. Last I heard, she'd put her house on the market. and was moving to a retirement community in Arizona. Presumably, every house was exactly the same shade of beige. My house still disappears on hot days. Every time it happens, I think about Karen's words. You wanted it less bright. Yes, I did. I wanted it so much less bright that I made it invisible. And in doing so, I made it the brightest house in the neighborhood, not in color, but in meaning. A testament to creativity, persistence, and the beautiful rebellion of refusing to be beige in a world that demands neutrality. Sometimes revenge isn't about hurting the person who hurt you. Sometimes it's about being so spectacularly, undeniably yourself that they can't help but see they never had power over you at all. Even when you disappear, you're still there, still vibrant, still visible to those who matter, still coral and turquoise at heart. If this story inspired you, resonated with you, or made you smile, please share it. We all know a Karen. We've all felt pressured to be less than we are to make others comfortable. Sometimes the best response is to be more creative, more bold, more authentically yourself. What's your color? What makes you bright? Share your story in the comments. Later. Meadowbrook Heights officially designated itself an art-friendly community, attracting creative professionals and innovative homeowners. Property values increased by an average of 18%. 3 more houses in the neighborhood installed artistic features, one with a kinetic sculpture garden, another with a living wall of native plants, a third with a mural by a local artist. Karen's old house sold to a young couple who immediately painted it bright yellow with purple trim. Barbara laughed for a solid 5 minutes when she heard, "Some victories," she said. "Keep on winning." "So what do I do?" "We fight," Barbara said firmly. "We gather evidence that your house isn't a traffic hazard. We document the community support, we emphasize the artistic and educational value, and we show that Karen is using this ordinance maliciously to harass you after losing every other battle." Diane Foster arrived an hour later, with a legal strategy and a thick folder of documentation. "I've been preparing for something like this," she said.